Power is rarely loud. In fact, the most enduring forms of authority almost never announce themselves. They do not demand attention. They do not justify their presence. And they do not explain why others should listen. Most people grow up believing authority is visible, that it reveals itself through titles, volume, certainty, or force. We are taught to recognize leaders by how decisively they act, how clearly they speak, or how confidently they command. From an early age, we learn to associate power with movement, noise, and assertion. But this understanding is incomplete, because some of the most influential individuals in human history did not rely on dominance, charisma, or persuasion. They did not overwhelm others with certainty or bend them through pressure. Instead, they relied on something quieter, subtler, and far more difficult to resist. They relied on silent authority. Have you ever noticed how certain people enter a room and nothing obvious changes, yet everything subtly adjusts? Conversations slow. Others become more careful with their words. Decisions begin to orient themselves in their direction. No instruction is given. No authority is declared. No demand is made. Yet influence is felt immediately. This is silent authority. It does not announce itself because it does not need permission to exist. It operates without explanation, without validation, and without urgency. And once you begin to notice it, something uncomfortable becomes clear. The people who possess this kind of authority are often the least interested in proving anything at all. They do not argue to be heard. They do not rush to clarify misunderstandings. They do not compete for attention. And still, others adjust. Why does authority sometimes emerge without effort? Why do some individuals command obedience without ever asserting power? And why do we often feel this influence long before we can explain it? Silent authority operates below language. It works before logic has time to intervene. It does not persuade through reasoning or emotion. It does not rely on fear or admiration. It is gravitational. Most of us sense it instinctively. Our posture shifts. Our tone softens. Our behavior recalibrates. Not because we are told to, but because something inside us decides to. Think back to the last time you altered your behavior around someone without consciously choosing to. You spoke more carefully. You hesitated before disagreeing. You found yourself waiting for their response before continuing. You may have felt watched, even without being observed. Was it respect? Was it uncertainty? Or was it something deeper, something harder to name? Silent authority does not rely on intimidation, does not create fear in the obvious sense. Instead, it creates awareness, a subtle sharpening of attention, a quiet sense that one's actions matter more in this moment. It lives in restraint, in composure, in the absence of urgency. And this is where it is most often misunderstood. We tend to associate power with action, with decisiveness, with visibility. We assume that influence must be exerted, demonstrated, or reinforced. But silent authority is built on withholding rather than expression. Withholding reactions, withholding explanations, withholding emotional leakage. This withholding is not weakness, it is containment. Why does restraint feel powerful? Why does silence often weigh more than speech? And why do humans, across cultures and generations, instinctively defer to those who appear internally settled? To understand silent authority, we must stop focusing on what people do and begin observing what they do not feel compelled to do. Because authority is not something we consciously grant. It is something we respond to automatically. And like most automatic responses, its roots run far deeper than awareness. Silent authority begins not with intention, but with perception. Long before someone speaks, the human mind is already evaluating them, not through careful reasoning or deliberate analysis, but through rapid, unconscious pattern recognition shaped by social survival. Humans are deeply attuned to cues that suggest stability, self-containment, and emotional economy. We trust what appears unmoved by pressure, not because it is superior, but because it feels predictable. Predictability signals safety, and safety, in social terms, often translates into influence. This is why people who rush to explain themselves often lose authority, even when their explanations are reasonable. Urgency communicates dependence. It signals that an outcome matters more to one person than to the other. When someone appears invested in being believed, the mind questions why. Have you noticed how certainty feels different when it doesn't ask to be believed? When someone speaks without defending their position, the mind assumes they don't need to. And that assumption carries weight. It suggests confidence without performance, security without display. Silent authority is not about appearing confident. Confidence is expressive. It wants to be seen. Silent authority is contained. It appears in ordinary settings, family gatherings, workplaces, negotiations, friendships. It often belongs to the individual least invested in winning the moment. Not because they are disengaged, but because their sense of position does not depend on immediate validation. Why does the absence of defensiveness feel like strength? Why do people instinctively yield to those who seem unbothered by disagreement? The human mind reads composure as capability. It reads restraint as control. And it reads emotional efficiency as power. This response is ancient. In early human groups, those who conserved energy, who did not react impulsively, were often the most reliable decision makers. They did not waste attention on unnecessary conflict. They observed before acting. Over time, emotional steadiness became associated with leadership and authority. That association never disappeared. Even today, we respond to it automatically. Silent authority also benefits from ambiguity. When someone does not clarify their intentions immediately, others fill in the gaps themselves. And the mind tends to project competence onto what it cannot easily read. Ambiguity invites interpretation, and interpretation often favors the silent party. Why does ambiguity shift power away from the one seeking clarity? Why do those who demand reassurance often surrender leverage without realizing it? Silence forces others to think, and thinking requires effort. The person who speaks less gives others more to process, and effort creates deference. Over time, people begin to anticipate the silent authority figure's reactions before they occur. They adjust preemptively. They shape their words, their timing, and their decisions around a presence that has never demanded anything. No instruction is ever given. No control is enforced. Yet alignment happens naturally. This is where the foundation is laid for influence that does not fade. Because what is never forced is rarely resisted. And if you find yourself recognizing these patterns as you listen, you are not alone. Awareness begins this way, quietly, gradually, often uncomfortably. This channel exists for people who notice these things, even when they cannot yet explain them. For people who sense that power does not always look the way it is described. If you are still listening, it means you are already paying attention in a way most people do not. And that matters, because what comes next is where silent authority stops feeling neutral and begins to reveal its deeper implications. At first, silent authority feels harmless. It feels calm, grounded, even reassuring. It often appears as maturity, as emotional intelligence, as someone who does not overreact, does not escalate, does not need to dominate the room. And sometimes that is exactly what it is. But this is where the pattern becomes more complicated, because silent authority is not inherently ethical or unethical. It is simply effective. And effectiveness, when left unexamined, has a tendency to drift away from intention. One of the most misunderstood aspects of silent authority is that it is frequently mistaken for kindness, humility, or wisdom. Sometimes it truly reflects those qualities, but sometimes it conceals something else. The difference does not lie in behavior, it lies in awareness. People who possess silent authority often understand something intuitively, even if they have never articulated it to themselves. The person who reacts first usually reveals more than the person who waits. And information is leverage. When someone remains quiet during moments of tension, others begin to speak more. They explain. They justify. They fill the space with words meant to clarify, defend, or soften their position. Why do humans rush to close silence? Why does uncertainty feel uncomfortable enough to provoke disclosure? Silence creates a vacuum, and most people are psychologically compelled to fill it. In doing so, they offer insight into their priorities, insecurities, fears, and intentions. The silent authority figure does not need to probe. They do not need to interrogate or pressure. They simply observe. This is where discomfort begins to surface, because at some point, silence stops being neutral. It becomes strategic. Not in the theatrical sense of manipulation, not in the obvious sense of control, but in the quieter sense of positioning. The silent individual learns, consciously or unconsciously, that withholding reaction gives them time, and time gives them advantage. Why does waiting shift the balance of power? Why does patience so often feel dominant? In many interactions, the person who moves last determines the direction of the outcome. By not responding immediately, silent authority forces others to reveal their position first. It allows one side to gather information while giving up none. This is not coercion. It is gravity. And gravity does not argue. It attracts, bends, and settles. Here is the contradiction that makes silent authority so difficult to challenge. It often feels respectful, yet it can quietly dominate a dynamic without appearing to. Those under its influence may believe they are choosing freely, even as their choices are shaped by pressures they cannot see. Have you ever agreed to something simply because the alternative felt awkward to express? Have you ever deferred, not because you were convinced, but because resistance felt unnecessary? Silent authority thrives in these moments. It does not demand compliance. It makes resistance feel disproportionate. And because nothing explicit is demanded, nothing feels worth opposing. Most challenges arise in response to force. People push back when they feel pushed. But silent authority applies no visible pressure. It offers no obvious point of opposition. There is nothing to push against. As a result, people often comply without ever labeling the experience as submission. They tell themselves they chose freely, that the decision made sense, that it was easier this way. Over time, this creates a subtle psychological hierarchy, not declared, not enforced, but felt. The individual with silent authority becomes a reference point. Others check themselves against them. They look for cues, even when none are given. They hesitate before acting, waiting for a reaction that may never come. This is where the pattern deepens, because once people begin orienting themselves around someone else's stillness, authority no longer needs to be exercised. It has already been internalized. Why does internalized authority feel natural? Why does it persist, even in the absence of the person who initiated it? The answer lies in conditioning. Humans learn quickly which behaviors produce stability and which produce friction. When silence consistently correlates with calm outcomes, the mind begins to associate it with correctness, and correctness becomes compliance. This process is not always malicious. In many cases, it is adaptive. Groups need stabilizing forces. Families benefit from emotional anchors. Organizations rely on individuals who do not escalate unnecessarily. But the same mechanism that creates stability can also create imbalance. Because when authority is never questioned, it is never examined. And when it is never examined, it begins to operate unchecked. This is the shadow side of silent authority. Not overt control, but absence of resistance. Not domination, but default alignment. At this stage, many people recognize something unsettling. They have experienced this dynamic before. Perhaps with a parent who never raised their voice, yet whose approval carried disproportionate weight. A teacher whose quiet presence shaped behavior without discipline. A manager who rarely gave instructions, but whose reactions determined outcomes. A partner whose silence ended arguments without resolution. Someone who never explained themselves fully. Never seemed rushed, never needed to justify their position. And yet, their influence shaped decisions long after conversations ended. Why does memory reinforce authority? Why do we continue to defer even when the original context has passed? Because the mind learns patterns faster than it unlearns them. Silent authority leaves an imprint, and once formed, that imprint does not require reinforcement. It simply activates. You begin to anticipate reactions before they occur. You adjust behavior before it is requested. You comply before resistance even enters awareness. This is not submission as most people imagine it. It is something quieter. It is adaptation. And adaptation, when repeated long enough, becomes identity. Silent authority does not peak quickly. It accumulates. Unlike overt power, which often provokes resistance and burns out through conflict, silent authority settles into a system gradually. Its influence increases not through escalation, but through duration. Time is its greatest ally. When a pattern repeats without friction, the mind stops questioning it. What once felt noticeable becomes normal. What once required attention fades into background structure. This is how silent authority becomes embedded. Over years, people begin to organize themselves around it unconsciously. They anticipate preferences that were never stated. They avoid conflicts that were never declared. They align without being instructed. No one remembers when the adjustment began. That is the point. Why does familiarity reduce awareness? Why do repeated behaviors stop registering as choices? Because the human mind prefers efficiency. Once it finds a stable pattern, it preserves it to conserve energy. Questioning stability feels unnecessary. Challenging it feels disruptive. In families, silent authority often belongs to the individual who remains emotionally steady while others fluctuate. Not the loudest parent, not the strictest, but the one whose approval feels rare, subtle, and therefore meaningful. Children learn early which reactions matter. They adapt to the parent who does not react impulsively, because unpredictability requires vigilance. The child watches closely. They adjust their behavior to maintain calm. They learn what keeps the emotional environment stable. Over time, this vigilance becomes habit. The child does not feel controlled. They feel attuned. And attunement often masquerades as closeness. But attunement shaped by silence is not the same as mutual understanding. It is a learned sensitivity to unspoken expectations.
This pattern often persists into adulthood.
The child becomes the adult who reads rooms quickly, anticipates reactions, and adapts preemptively. They mistake this skill for intuition, when it is often conditioning. Silent authority leaves fingerprints across generations. In workplaces, the pattern takes a different form. Silent authority often belongs to the person who speaks last, or not at all. The one whose opinion is never forced into the discussion, but whose absence is noticed. Meetings continue without them, yet decisions feel incomplete. Why does absence sometimes amplify influence? Why does restraint command more attention than participation? Because when someone does not compete for space, their presence gains density. Others begin to fill that space with assumptions, often favorable ones. Competence, judgment, perspective. These qualities are projected, not proven, and projection is powerful. As silent authority compounds, it reshapes hierarchy without ever redefining it. Titles remain the same. Roles appear unchanged. Yet the true center of gravity shifts. People defer to the person they trust, not to overreact. Not to escalate, not to need reassurance. This trust grows quietly. And trust, once established, becomes difficult to withdraw. Why does trust persist even when circumstances change? Why do we continue to defer long after the original reasons are no longer relevant? Because trust is not constantly reassessed. It is assumed until broken. Silent authority rarely breaks it. Instead, it relies on consistency, on emotional economy, on the predictability of not imposing. And so, resistance fades, not because it is defeated, but because it never seems necessary. This is where long-term consequences begin to emerge. Decisions start to orbit the silent authority figure. People wait for their reaction before committing. Disagreements soften preemptively. Alternative viewpoints are filtered internally before being expressed. Even opposition becomes careful, not out of fear, but out of respect mixed with uncertainty. And uncertainty favors the one least affected by it. As years pass, this dynamic becomes self-sustaining. The silent authority figure no longer needs to be present to influence outcomes. Their preferences are anticipated. Their reactions are simulated mentally by others. This is internalized authority. Why does internalized authority feel voluntary? Why do people experience compliance as choice? Because the mind values coherence. Once it has learned a pattern, it preserves it to avoid friction. Questioning the pattern would require effort. And effort feels unnecessary when the system appears stable. This is why silent authority often intensifies with age. Older individuals who have practiced emotional restraint for decades naturally carry this presence. They do not rush. They do not explain unnecessarily. They do not chase relevance. Their stillness signals experience, and experience commands deference. Younger individuals sense this immediately, even if they cannot articulate why. They slow down. They listen more closely. They adjust. Not because they are instructed to, but because something in them recognizes continuity. This is why silent authority often appears wiser than it is. Longevity reinforces perception. Time adds weight. But here lies the danger. When authority goes unexamined for too long, it stops being adaptive and starts becoming absolute. Not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly. Because those influenced by it stop checking their own instincts. They look outward instead of inward. They measure correctness by alignment rather than understanding. This is not domination in the traditional sense. It is dependency. And dependency rarely announces itself. It feels like ease, like harmony, like order, until the moment it isn't. Silent authority becomes most powerful at the moment it is recognized, not because recognition weakens it, but because recognition restores choice. Until now, The pattern has operated beneath awareness. It has shaped interactions through instinct, habit, and learned response. People have adjusted without questioning why. They have deferred without naming what they were responding to. Awareness interrupts this automaticity, and interruption creates space. This does not mean silent authority disappears once it is seen. It means it is no longer absolute. Its influence becomes contextual rather than assumed. It becomes something you can notice, evaluate, and respond to consciously. The first thing awareness changes is interpretation. You begin to notice who fills space and who allows space to reorganize around them. You notice who explains and who lets meaning settle without clarification. You notice who reacts quickly and who allows others to move first. And once you notice these patterns, you realize how often you have misread them. Have you ever mistaken volume for importance? Have you ever confused certainty with competence? Have you ever assumed that silence meant agreement when it was simply restraint? Awareness sharpens perception. It reveals that silent authority is not mystical. It is behavioral. It emerges from consistency, emotional containment, and a refusal to compete for attention. This understanding does something subtle but important. It removes the illusion that authority is something other people simply possess, and that others must respond to automatically. Authority becomes visible as a pattern, and patterns can be examined. This is where autonomy begins to return. Not through rebellion, not through confrontation, but through discernment. You no longer feel compelled to rush. You no longer feel obligated to fill silence. You no longer interpret restraint as superiority by default. Instead, you begin to ask quieter questions. Is this authority earned or assumed? Is this silence grounded or strategic? Is my response habitual or chosen? These questions do not weaken relationships. They strengthen them. Because relationships built on unconscious hierarchy eventually harden. They become rigid, predictable, and difficult to adjust. Relationships built on awareness remain flexible. They allow space for recalibration. Silent authority, when integrated consciously, becomes something else entirely. It becomes presence. Presence without control. Stability without dominance. Influence without dependency. This is the difference between authority that guides and authority that governs. One invites alignment. The other quietly expects it. Understanding this distinction matters, because without awareness, silent authority shapes your decisions invisibly. With awareness, it becomes one signal among many, not the final one. And this shift is subtle. It does not feel like empowerment. It feels like clarity. Clarity about when you are choosing freely. Clarity about when you are adapting automatically. Clarity about whose stillness you are responding to and why. Silent authority is not something one acquires deliberately. It emerges when identity no longer negotiates for approval. When a person stops needing to convince, justify, or perform, their behavior becomes economical. Their presence becomes steady. Their reactions become selective. And the mind responds. The paradox is simple and uncomfortable. The less someone needs recognition, the more influence they tend to have. Not because they seek control, but because they are no longer driven by the same pressures as others. Once you see this pattern, it does not disappear. You begin to notice it everywhere. In elders who speak rarely, but are listened to carefully. In leaders who do not dominate conversation, yet quietly shape outcomes. In individuals whose calm is not performative, but practiced. And you also begin to notice when it is missing. When silence is empty rather than grounded. When restraint hides uncertainty rather than strength. When authority is assumed without foundation. This awareness does not demand action. It demands patience. Because understanding human nature is not a technique to be applied. It is a lens to be refined over time. Each experience sharpens it. Each interaction adds texture. And this is why people return to these ideas again and again at different stages of life. Because the patterns do not change. Only our ability to see them does. If you are still here, still listening, it means you recognize something familiar in these observations. Not as theory, but as lived experience. You have seen these dynamics play out in families, in workplaces, in relationships, in yourself. This space exists for that kind of attention. For people who prefer understanding over noise. For those who notice what others overlook. For those who are less interested in being told what to think, and more interested in seeing clearly. If you choose to continue exploring these patterns, not as entertainment, but as understanding, then staying connected to this channel is simply a way of continuing that process. Not to follow, not to agree, but to observe. The final question is not whether silent authority exists. It is this. Once authority no longer needs to announce itself, who is really in control? The one who commands, or the one who never has to? And perhaps more importantly, when you feel yourself adjusting, slowing down, yielding, deferring, are you responding consciously, or simply following a pattern you never questioned?